Hello and welcome, everybody. Zainab, stop talking.
Yeah.
Okay, today we're going to be talking about social justice. We're going to be covering more than that, but I just forgot to put the extra things in the contents when I added things as I went along. Please stop talking too early. We're going to be talking about the stock and how you analyze stock debates. Lots of social justice movements are based on one very clear trade-off. Oh, I see. Okay. Then we're going to be talking about NGOs and how you can apply them in debates. Then we're going to be talking about fracturing, diversity, organization, and social media and how they interlink with each other. We're also going to mention principles and buy-in as well. Okay, the stock trade-off in social movement debates, in the vast majority of them, is a comparison between safe spaces and a broad movement. So the broad movement tends to be less ideologically pure, whereas safe spaces tends to be a much more concentrated collection of people. So safe spaces is when, oh, I copied and pasted that. They both say the same thing. Safe spaces is when there are a few people in the movement and those people tend to congregate with each other. They tend to be very similar to each other, and as such, they can support each other through various things. Broad movements are when there are lots of people in the movement and there's a better chance of achieving policy aims. This is not necessary to broad movements, but it tends to be easier to access that impact in the end when you're talking about broad movements. My general advice on this comparison is that oftentimes people misunderstand at a very basic level what side of the debate they're arguing for. So maybe they're arguing for this side which is inherently more radical, and then they argue that it's going to lead to a more broad movement. This is kind of a waste of time because it's a bit of an uphill battle. It's better to pick a very clear comparative in the debate and weigh on that comparative because then it's easier to win. Obviously, you can try and co-opt the benefits of either side, but I'll show you how to weigh those benefits a little later on. In terms of safe spaces, so it's important to note that there are some debates where safe spaces aren't relevant. So for example, some debates are about sort of like extremism in the actions that you take to be able to convince people. So maybe that's like a violent movement or that kind of thing. And there are other debates which are like much more like about ideological purity rather than a particular like location or, you know, setting where people can feel safe. So it's important to note that this is not always the comparative. In lots of debates it is, however. I think a particular issue that people have with safe spaces is oftentimes people are able to analyze that a safe space might exist, so the logical reasons behind that, but they struggle to illustrate what that might look like, and therefore they struggle to sort of impact that claim and make it something which is compelling to the judges, therefore. So a couple examples, and we're going to go through an exercise where we also think of our examples ourselves of how particular safe spaces look. Are these, so firstly, in lots of places, then religion has a heavy influence over like how people view the environment. So for example, after the Pope in 2016 began condemning climate change, said that pollution was a sin, then lots of religious safe spaces emerged where people could have discussion groups and meetings with other religious people about the environment. And obviously this is something which is beneficial because it helps to soothe lots of people's nerves about the environment when it becomes an existential crisis in lots of people's lives. Additionally, there are other places like gay bars, for example, where you're more insulated against homophobic attacks and you're more able to act, I guess, more freely and gaily in those areas because you're less worried about those kinds of things. Additionally, there are things like online communities which might be infiltrated by people, whereas you can have discussions on a personal level with people. Additionally, there are things like limiting free speech. So you can limit free speech externally to people. So for example, with the example of slurs, then we limit the free speech of other people to create safe spaces where people feel comfortable experimenting with hearing slurs, for example. But you can also limit free speech. For example, you might limit free speech where you don't really want to discuss particular issues by creating taboos around those issues. So maybe not talking about racism in certain areas. Lastly, and this is something which Eli mentioned, is language restricted places. So for lots of people who are deaf, then people who aren't deaf struggle to speak with them in sign language either because they don't understand sign language or they're too lazy or ignorant to speak to those people in sign language, which makes it very hard for these people to just sort of like operate on a day-to-day life because they feel excluded. Even though they could lip read, it's probably much harder than understanding sign language. And therefore, it's important for people to have language restricted spaces where they can feel comfortable and freely communicate with individuals and stuff like that. The important thing here is once you've illustrated, you need to directly compare this to the way that broad movements manifest, and you need to make some quite clear trade-offs. So the first thing is kind of a sneaky thing that you can do. Maybe not prioritize this, but comparison, but it's still something which is good to co-opt the other side, which is explain that safe spaces often create better organizational capabilities. Because if you think about the way that people understand social or like operate in social movements, is very often about the amount of discussion you can have to understand what the best arguments for your social movement is publicly, or maybe organizing with people certain protests or those kinds of things. And so when you have a specific environment which people collect to, kind of like a bar in a sitcom where everyone, you know, goes and hangs out, then you're better able to spark those discussions about social movements. Additionally, the expansion of safe spaces leads to more broad inclusion. So for example, you might see a gay bar on the street, and that might sort of like through osmosis encourage you to like understand that these are people who are prevalent in society or those kinds of things. So through osmosis, also like, for example, the restriction of language is an example of safe spaces, which has sort of like promoted ideas about inclusion through osmosis in society. So these kinds of things are benefits of safe spaces as well. Here you can weigh on social change over policy goals, because social change firstly tends to be much more concrete, but secondly is marginal, or maybe not marginal, it's scalar. So a policy has to have 50% of the people who are in parliament pass that policy, whereas a social inclusion can happen gradually, and that means that it's more certain of an impact, because if it's not like a one specific tipping point, then it's much easier to access some benefit from that. The final thing, and I actually think I put it last, but I think I would compare it as the first and main comparison of safe spaces, is just catharsis. And I wouldn't use this word because it's pretty lame, but I think the benefit of explaining catharsis, which is just, you know, people feel good when they're in these environments, is you can weigh firstly on exclusivity. So, you know, I guess intuitively, but secondly, in terms of likelihood, because it's such a intuitive concept which is related to safe spaces. That's the reason why they're created in the first place. That's the reason why people attend them. But when you compare this to a broad movement, then the movement is succeeding is far more speculative, and therefore you can weigh on this. I would like to ask you guys, there's a third bit of weighing which you can talk about with catharsis. I wonder if anyone has any ideas or maybe more bits of weighing in how to weigh this claim. I'll pick on people if you don't raise your hands. I'll pick someone who's not looking at me. Matt.
I'm eating my sandwich.
That's okay. That's okay. All right, we need to lock in. I'm going to ask you some more questions. The other way you can weigh this. Oh yeah, Cyrus, go.
Sometimes something about these people particularly, they're the ones who bear the brunt of the social harms of being in those identity groups. Therefore, the gay bars are particularly those people.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that later, actually, in our principles section. But a different way you can weigh this is just in terms of the efficacy of the movement as well. Because when you have a safe space to relax and decompress for lots of individuals, then it becomes easier to deal with your day-to-day, or in particular, fight oppression, if that's something which is valuable. So that's another way to sort of co-opt the other side.
To say,
Yeah, go for it.
to say that these safe spaces are often the basis for the wider movements. Think about something like Stonewall.
Yeah.
It originated in these small communities and then becomes a wider movement.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good example, actually. And that's sort of osmosis in a way, because people saw the gay bars and saw the value in that, and then protested after they got raided. But yeah, I think that's distinct, and that's good. Yeah. Sorry. Yes. I was
The
thinking.
one on the left over there.
Oh shit.
Just
There we go. Is that helpful? Is it not kind of shining? Well, oh well. Okay. You can just like shut your like
we move the TV to the side. Oh, no.
Yeah, we're not gonna fuck with it.
I was enjoying watching this. You just move it a little bit. That really sharp.
Is that good? Also, like, so I get both of you all sort of stand like this. Okay. In terms of the broad movement, this is just like an absolute godsend in these debates, because you're just like, well, we get better, you know, society for these people. And that's, you know, better than any sort of like small benefit you can get, because they're still getting oppressed. But there are some other bits that you can use to compare these kinds of things. The first thing is having a diversity in a movement is good to make compelling arguments in the media. And the reason for this is, firstly, oftentimes people who are attacked in the media are the ones who have to sit in these interviews and get grilled on like their personal identity, for example, which is something which is like extremely mentally taxing for lots of people. And obviously interviewers aren't kind people in these scenarios, so they find the most cutting and pressing questions to ask people. So having allies in movements is very helpful for like helping in these situations. But additionally, you can say the reason why the social movement exists is because people in these societies aren't valued nearly as much as other people. And so having, like, for example, somebody who is not like demonized or infantilized might be good to have appear in these messages, because those individuals are like more respected by society. There's a good ContraPoints video on this. I didn't link it because I want you guys to like scroll through and watch them all so that you can find it. But lots of her videos are really good for debate analysis in particular. So if you like write down all the mechanisms that she says, then those are very helpful. And they're as well mechanized. But yeah, there's a good video on this. The other thing, money is a prerequisite. You've probably heard this a trillion times, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. More people, the third reason is that more people is good for selecting talent. So this is just like a general economic theory, which is the greater diversity of people you can select from, the best ability is, the best chance there is for somebody who's quite exceptional at something to rise through the ranks and be able to help the movement. So maybe someone who understands finance as well as Hannah does is able to sort of like help with the movement, gather their funds, and stuff like that. The fifth reason is that there's less, that these people are less vulnerable to arrests when there's a more broad movement. And the reason for this is when a movement is more concentrated, and this is what Leanda explained, when a movement is more, he explained this to me rather, when a movement is more concentrated, then it's much more likely that you're able to very easily intercept that movement and intercept its tactics, especially when there's one tactic that they're using, for example, because there are fewer people doing fewer things in that movement. And so, for example, I think it's called Quantel is when the FBI basically invaded loads and loads of social movements from 1956 to 1971. So feminist movements, but in particular the Black Panthers, where basically they just like gaslit them a bunch. Yeah.
I would note that like number 5 is dependent on the specific social and legal context those groups are finding out.
Yeah.
So like, for instance, Rupert Murdoch was able to use the broad swathe of the trade union movements to find trade unions that were more associated with the right wing to infiltrate them and then end up like messing over the messing over like different workers at certain points. So I think those who are far less legally inclined social movements are this ain't fully true.
Yeah.
I think the opposite occurs when the social movement is more legally inclined. Its ability to be infiltrated probably increases.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well, because obviously this is likely to happen more in authoritarian states with social movements as well, even though this particular example is from the US, which might be an authoritarian state as well. Yeah.
So imagine you're on the side, which is, you have broad movement handed to you on a silver platter. The video closing, right? So your opening runs number 2, which is that money is a prerequisite, and it's like definitely going to win the debate. And you run 1, 3, even 4 and 5. What advice do you have on how to weigh these other factors over money as a prerequisite success for a social movement?
So I think number 3 is actually really good to be prior to the money thing, because if you have a badly organized movement which chucks its money in like weird places, then there's no point in having money. If you don't have somebody who's able to, like manage or collect the money, for example, so they don't have expertise in like how to set up like bank accounts and organizations and those kinds of things, then there's no point in having money being thrown at you because you're not able to use it well. So I guess that's the way that I'd explain that. Yeah, and I think each of these you can find ways to weigh them against each other as well if you're in closing, because they're all quite compelling. I asked for more, but you guys can think of more in the debate later. There's a really good workshop on social justice. You guys have also probably all watched it, which is the Manchester workshop. If you just type in Manchester social justice, then the point of this video is to explain why framing a social movement is really important before you go into the argumentation. So if you want to learn how to frame a social movement, then watch that workshop as well. That might be extra work, but whatever. Okay, we're going to do an exercise now. So everyone needs to be super, super locked in. 2 questions for this exercise, and I'll ask a different person for each question. So if I ask you, then don't answer both because I want to ask another person. So the first question is going to be, which side is which comparative? So is it a safe space that you have to defend, or is it a broad movement? The second question is, how would you illustrate that safe space? So what examples of that safe space would you use? The first question, or the first motion, is this house believes that the LGBTQ+ community should actively combat the stereotype of queer hypersexuality. Yeah, Kate.
Because you'd be pointing out that you'd be trying to kick out a particular group that you think is maybe less socially acceptable. So you're simultaneously shrinking the movement while also alienating a group that's potentially less.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I'm not sure. Have you got anything to comment on that, Eli?
I would argue that combating queer hypersexuality is a broad movement thing, because what you're trying to do is make yourself more palatable to people who may not already be a part of the LGBT community. Because if you're queer and hypersexual, then realistically you buy into the LGBT movement basically regardless. And it's very difficult to alienate you. But if you're like some random straight person on the street who's probably like slightly conservative, queer hypersexuality might make you uncomfortable and disincentivize you from engaging with the movement. But them combating it might make you join the movement.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair intuition, Kate, in terms of how you would be excluding some people. But yeah, I think I'd agree with Eli here, which is oftentimes the more ideologically like in favor of the way that people exist within the movement is the one which tends to represent the safe spaces more. Does anyone have any examples of how they would illustrate this? Yeah. Cyrus.
Individuals would probably curve.
The first one is a good example. Yeah, I think that's good. Also, for example, in lots of pride parades, then they have things called kink parades, which might be combated with you when you're combating those stereotypes. Yeah. Oh, there we go. This house supports social movements condemning celebrities who fail to use their platforms to advocate for urgent socio-political causes. Yeah.
This one's more in the safe spaces direction because it's going for a radical tactic. It wants, instead of making it easy to join the movement, they're demanding action and a code of work from people.
Yeah.
Which generally means it's not going to be a broad movement. They want safer spaces for football.
Yeah, so proposition supports the more safe spaces. And how would you illustrate these safe spaces? Yeah.
I mean, I suppose it would just be whatever spaces are being used to do the condemnation of these celebrities. So if it's via some sort of newspaper or if it's via social media, then it's just whatever forms or pages actually promote that condemnation.
Yeah, exactly. It's the Twitter comment section. Ironically, is a safe space in this debate. Okay. This house believes that social movements should cooperate with large corporations rather than opposing them. Great motion, right? Yeah, go again.
So if you're cooperating with large corporations, it generally means you're going to have a broader movement, you're going to have more money. So that's for, and also it's generally against safe spaces because often corporations have like certain conservative like alignments in that they're often have regressive social views, not always, but things like with like MasterCard currently, you can see that if you are cooperating with corporations, you're likely going to have to compromise on certain ideas.
Yeah, that's really good. And I guess this debate isn't about a particular social movement. So everybody should be able to answer a question for where a corporation has influenced some social movement. So what safe space might this impact? Go again, yeah.
I mean, the example earlier of like hypersexual queer community currently being pushed off of all platforms because of MasterCard and Visa.
Yeah, perfect. Or even at like things like pride parades and stuff like that.
Just like
Yeah.
corporations, or just like corporations who only put like pride on like during like Pride Month when they change their Twitter logo to have a pride flag. Like, do we support that or against that? Because like that feels like it's just something for large corporations.
Like which side would be supporting that?
So like as in this would be like like support large corporations even when they do the minor things that
Oh.
should just be already accepted.
Yeah.
And like instead we should be opposing that and saying we demand them.
Yeah.
If you're the opposition.
Yeah, I think that's good. Sure.
This one to me is one where you can also run safe spaces on Gov saying that you have queer networking groups in big companies that would otherwise. I can't think of any of your grandness.
Yeah, so you could co-opt the benefits in this particular debate. I think that's very fair to point out. Okay, this house as hearing parents of a deaf child who will go deaf before turning 18 would send their child to a mainstream school as opposed to a deaf school. And I believe this is the last one. Yeah.
Well, broad movement is safe spaces because we're like making the child kind of forcefully integrate with society outside of that safe space.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you agree with that, Eli?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to expand upon that because not only is it like forcing the child to, I guess, integrate a little bit, but it's also like you would hope expanding awareness for like the, you know, school that they end up going to about the difficulties that these people face. So,
Yeah, that's actually a really good argument for this debate. And I guess the illustration is in the motion, which is the safe space is the deaf school. I've got a joke here. But we don't have to discuss that too much. Okay, we're not going to review that either because we've already talked about these things. Okay, let's just do a little conclusion here. Obviously, I've got more things to yap about in a second. Step one, check if the debate is the stock comparison. So as I've mentioned, sometimes they're not. Secondly, identify which side you're on, as we've been doing here. Thirdly, prove your claim, which shouldn't take a huge amount of time in the debate, given that lots of CA teams set them with this forced comparative. But as we've seen, sometimes they don't have this exact comparative because you can co-opt things from either side. But importantly, in this step, you have to illustrate your claims. Step 4, spend lots of time on the comparisons. Step 5, win, as I always do in social justice motion. I have like very few things to say about buy-in or buyout because it also makes my eyes roll a little bit. But the thing that I say in literally every single social justice debate is that broad movements often don't have buyout because people opt in for individualized and personalized reasons, so won't be alienated against the cause. And I think this is something which Eli has said earlier in this workshop as well. It's very good analysis, but you can literally say it in every social justice debate if you're able to tailor it well. I'm glad I'm not judging this CT because I'll probably be hearing that. In terms of whether like offensive things to use with buy-in or buyout, one offensive thing you could do is say a slur, but you probably shouldn't do that. The second thing is you can obviously mitigate this by still making your arguments comparative. So how much effort people put in, how easy it is to create networks when people are less caring about the movements. Yeah.
I think the way to make buy-in or buyout effective is often not with like the raw numbers game because like people that don't give a shit like don't donate anyway. But it's often about like ensuring that you get influential people buying or buying out. So for example, if BLM was to do action X versus action Y, does this make like black pastors buy out or something like that? It's probably something more important than just general people because you can also impact that based on their net influence within the movement.
Yeah, and I guess that's good advice for every debate, which is pick specific actors which you're talking about and explain why those individuals are the most important in the debate, rather than say that this changes something for everybody in a debate. Yeah, Kate.
Broad movements are likely to be more hostile to the most marginalized members of a particular social group that's advocating, which is very often true because of people who don't completely understand getting involved. But at the same time, I think that if you're arguing for a broad movement, you can flip this strategically by saying that small social movements tend to be more focused on ideological purity, and a consequence of this is that either individuals who are concerned with maybe moral purity or something else or bad actors can take advantage of that by forcing people out of the group, particularly people with other intersecting marginalizations who will still be discriminated against.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really, really good point, which is another bit of comparison you can use earlier on if you want to compare why broad movements might be something which are beneficial. Yeah.
I think vaguely-ish on the same course. There's also the fact that in smaller movements, because of the extent to which you have like that ideological purity, and usually you have particular people who are persuasive and convincing people of the importance of that pure ideological idea, these movements are also rife for abuse. And influence about asymmetries of power, like that.
Oh, I see. Like people who want to consolidate lots of power at the top of those movements. Yeah, that's also a very good point. Okay, we're going to chat about principles. I stole this from Ayman, who stole this from Dylan, who probably stole this from somebody else, maybe some philosophy textbook somewhere. So we're going to chat about this in social justice motions. So the main thing which you can talk about in terms of principles is just the X social movement has an obligation to protect X person. the biggest question here is, well, if a social movement has an obligation to protect the group of people that it represents, then, you know, one side might say, well, protecting one group looks like having safe spaces. And then the other side might say, well, protecting people might be getting policy goals for these individuals. So I think you have to make this non-contingent on practical outcomes. The way that you should do this is you have to make it contingent on something, like some outcome. The outcome that you make it contingent on is more generally the principles which the movement stands for. So for example, the principles which the movement itself like exists under. So for example, with the feminist movement to support body shield protests, then that would violate the feminist principle that to instrumentalize the body for means of militancy is inherently a tool of patriarchy, so ought be opposed. So understanding principles which movements stand behind is very important for this analysis. So make sure you do your reading on the histories and the constitutions of these movements. But this is the first claim that you make to make it non-contingent. To link it back, then you still have to say why the social movement has to fulfill its principal obligation that it exists under, if that makes sense. So there are a couple of different ways to link these things together. The first thing is in terms of ideological purity. So for example, the movement only exists to represent its principles. That's like the point of the movement, just as the Republican Party exists to like represent Republicans. And so when it doesn't do this, then no longer is it that movement. The second thing, which I think is very interesting, is in terms of an obligation to labor. So what you can use here is an explanation for why people have entitlement over the labor that they use. So I don't know if any of you guys have taken political thinkers, but the theory there is John Locke came up with this idea where he said, if I have like a rake and I rake, you know, my garden, then that garden is now mine because I put my labor into that. Just as that is true, then you can also claim that for social movements. So the people who uphold or stand for these social movements, who created these social movements, had certain principles, and they have an entitlement to be fulfilled by those principles via the movement because they're the reason why those social movements exist. Yeah. And then I guess the third point is the same thing. Is it? I can't read that.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
Doesn't the obligation to labor thing sometimes could contradict ideological purity? Because if the feminist movement does something that engenders people to join the feminist movement, those people are then what the feminist movement is, right? Because the second one presumes that it's the people who construct the movement that construct the ideology, whereas the first one presumes that it's the ideology that comes prior to the people. Or are you just saying you can weaponize these in either way that you want to?
Well, I guess that's the way that all debating works. But I think the point is that it happens at the point at which the motion happens, rather than people after. Because, you know, before the motion happens, then they have no entitlement to the movement because they've not done diddly squat for the movement. Okay, I think something very interesting that people don't really talk about in social justice debates is how NGOs work in comparison to social justice movements. And NGOs are often really important for the functioning of, like, you know, general protest in society or these movements in general. So NGOs tend to be really, really good. Firstly, for having social clout. So if you think of Greenpeace, then there's probably no other organization, maybe in the entire world, religious, governmental, corporate, which has more like respect or credibility as these kinds of organizations, because they stand for a very specific principle and people respect this sort of like rights of the group to do that. And I guess that's just an important like intuition to use, which is people very like tend to respect these institutions a huge amount. Additionally, because they're respected so much, then they tend to get invited to things like international summits and bodies. So for example, the UN or COP conferences, if you're like an environmental NGO, for example, but there are also lots of other like UN forums for various social justice issues. This is really important for NGOs in general, because you're able to trade expertise. So you're able to meet people from other countries who might have been pursuing social justice, or maybe you're trying to understand various tactics, which might be good. Additionally, you can get social clout to lobby governments because you're a respected organization. So it's much easier to get a foot in the door. Additionally, if you're an official organization, which an NGO is in comparison to a social justice movement, then you're much more able to do things like actually have employees on your payroll, or actually, you know, like get formal donations through it as well, which means that you're able to actually operate much more cohesively, and also can like be able to last a lot into the long term. The other thing is about connections. I already mentioned that, but like Jeffrey Epstein. Okay. The important thing is you have to link NGOs being good back to social justice movements. You can link this back to broad movements particularly. So when a movement is broad, then they're much more likely to, even if they fragment, much more likely to professionalize, because there are certain sects of the movement which want to create organizations to be able to further the goals of that organization. So for example, Greenpeace was initially much more of like an informal organization, and then became an NGO over time when the environmental movement became more broad and accepting of people. And this happens to an extent with Black Lives Matter or Extinction Rebellion. I should have actually Googled it, whether they actually are NGOs. I'm not sure they are. Yeah, so this tends to happen when the social movements have ideological moderate sections to the social movements, if not the entire social movement is ideologically moderate. And in other instances, sympathetic to more radical causes. The good thing that you can say about broad movements creating NGOs is that oftentimes social movements are very heavily complemented by NGOs, because they're able to do lots of grunt work for those social movements. So for example, if lots of people in your protest are getting arrested, then it's important to have a legal NGO which helps you out, where people do pro bono work to help with your litigation if people who are getting arrested aren't able to pay for their legal fees, for example. But also it's really good, for example, if you're doing civil disobedience, attempting to maybe delay a policy from happening, or attempting to delay a company from like chopping down a forest, then it's very good to have people lobbying governments simultaneously as when you're doing your social movement, so that you're better able to actually get like change happening within the governmental sphere, because obviously civil disobedience or these kinds of protests can't last forever. The last thing is it's really good for expertise. So if you have an NGO, then they can put academics on the payroll to do studies. So for example, climate scientists, but also this just happens, you can like research things like discrimination through NGOs and that kind of thing. So this also helps to complement the arguments of a social justice movement as well. This is an extension, probably in a debate. You probably don't want to come straight out the gates with this. But yeah, I think the flip side of this is that NGOs, yeah, Josh.
If the main conclusion with the team is buying finances, how would you win with an NGO conclusion? Presumably, if I run buying or finances, I'm relying on an organization doing something already, like it's implicit in my argument.
Yeah, but I think you can explain why professionalization in different ways creates NGOs, because buying and finances is different, I think, from an official organizations which do things. So they're just two distinct arguments, I think. Yeah, I think you can also say that NGOs can be bad. So in lots of instances, NGOs become so ideologically moderate in favor of achieving their goals, like getting into government, that they stop doing anything beneficial, and in some instances start doing things which are ideologically bad for the movement. So for example, something which is very prominent for NGOs is like greenwashing or pinkwashing or that kind of thing, where they certify a company and just to like, get money from that company, and then they're less able to sort of like, well, I guess they like, sanitize the image of that company. So that's something which happens, for example, with the World Wildlife Fund, where they put their pandas all over Coca-Cola's bottles, even though Coca-Cola is doing loads of harm to the environment with all the plastic that it's producing. And that just makes Coca-Cola seem like a better company after it's got the WWF logo slapped onto it, especially since they have so much social clout, as we mentioned before. The other interesting way in which NGOs make things happen is oftentimes they make more radical sects of movements as well. And the reason for this is oftentimes people become disillusioned with NGOs becoming too moderate. So they fracture off into smaller groups where they pursue more radical tactics, or they have more radical ideology. So for example, then with Greenpeace, then from Greenpeace fractured off Friends of the Earth, which was a different organization, which was initially much more radical than Greenpeace. But over time, they were also like, oh, money and lobbying, so they became more moderate. And then off of Friends of the Earth, then that split off the Animal Liberation Fund, or I'm not sure if it's fund, but yeah, the ALF, which then started to like fucking, I don't know, like go into like farms and like, like destroy the farms and free the animals and shit like that. And then they started to become more moderate as they became more closer to NGO, and then split off the ELF, which was like an anarcho-communist, like underground, leaderless like group, where they would like put spikes in trees, and then companies would try and chop them down, and then the spikes would like go into people's nets.
What was the average length of memories? How
That's good. Yeah.
Just one flag on the difference between NGOs and social movements. I think that NGOs can manifest as more ideologically moderate, but I think that oftentimes the way they manifest as just more acceptable to the general norm. So like Autism Speaks is an NGO for autism that would be viewed as ideologically moderate, or might be viewed as ideologically moderate by like someone who's not autistic. But for the autistic community, Autism Speaks is extremely radical because the things they advocate for are like extreme therapy to force non-speaking autistic people to learn how to speak, because that's what's more acceptable to the norm. So I think the other way to think about how ideologically moderate might manifest for an NGO is just as closer to the norm of what is accepted.
Yeah, that's very fair. And I guess you can also explain the flip of that, which is since they tend to be much more sanitized to the public, then they're more able to get away with good radical actions if that's something which they're arguing for. Yeah.
Maybe I think you said that something as well. There's analysis to be done about, and you can flip this to be both positive and negative, which is that often the contact points between a social movement and like an NGO is on their like diversity day or whatever, but it means that social movements get contact points with people that are like cringe centrists, because the problem becomes that in a lot of social movements they become like echo chambers, and that you analyze to be a bad thing. So consequently, like you like touch grass and talk to like real normal people, and that could be good.
Yeah, that's a good impact of this argument as well. Okay, we're good to go. Oh, okay. I don't know why I wrote the elevated stock. It's not really elevated stock very much. It's just like, you know, things. I think a very important feature of social media debates is social justice debates is understanding the current context of how social justice operates, which is very different to how it operated in the past, because most social justice motions happen with the impact of social media. So I think that's obviously on very frequently some very good framing to use, which is social media is either able to amplify your social movement or make it more shit, depending on what side you are. So I think it's more easy to explain or more intuitive to explain why social media might amplify your movement, because it just goes back into the broad movement stuff where more people can advocate or like have like tacit acceptance of your like movement in general. I think a harder thing to do is explain why social media is a bad thing for social movements. So it probably does lead to bigger movements. So Fridays for Future, the Arab Spring, something called Gezi Park, which I'll discuss in a second. But in lots and lots of instances, it leads to worse organization. And an intuition for this is, I don't know if you guys have ever heard that claim, which is Margaret Thatcher started neoliberalism in the UK with 4 people in a taxi. It's very good to have a couple people who are very organized and dedicated to a movement, such that they can plan out that movement rather than have sporadic people who are just looking at each other's Instagram stories. And that leads to leaderless movements. In some instances, obviously Fridays for Future had a leader, but in lots of instances it leads to unorganized social movements because they're hella cunts and the cunts have no clue what they're doing because they saw an Instagram story and they showed up. And I think you can go more rigorously into the analysis for this once you do that, but this is the general gist of the argument. Importantly, when there are lots of people in social movements, that leads to fracturing of a social movement. We can discuss whether that's good or bad here. But generally, you can explain why social media leads to less organization, which leads to more like breaking up of these social movements. So with fracturing, then I'll go for why fracturing is bad first, because I think that's more intuitive. Fracturing is bad because it leads to less clear demands. And oftentimes people struggle to illustrate this in debates. A good illustration of this is a set of protests which happened in Turkey in 2016 called the Gezi Park protests. So basically the government was going to build a parking lot on this park in the middle of Istanbul, I'm pretty sure. And people were obviously like, no, I don't really want a park in the middle or a parking lot in the middle of my park because I enjoy my park. What happened then was lots of environmental activists went and had a sit-in in the park. But because it gathered so much attention, then there were loads of other social movements which decided that they were also going to jump in on this protest. So like racial justice movements, feminist movements, etc., all with like different claims. And the issue here became that the government saw that there were so many people on the street that they brought like 6 or 7 different organizers into a room for a couple of days. And they were like, okay, we're going to negotiate with you. What do you want? Please stop, call off your protest. Then these people continued to argue with each other for 2 days. And then the Turkish government was like, okay, police riot shields and rubber bullets, and then the protest had to break up because everybody gave up. So I think that's like an ostensible or like just a very concrete example, even to help with further with analyzing a hypothetical chance that a social movement might be not very good. But it helps to reinforce your claims if you're trying to make that, because if you said that to a judge in the abstract, they might be like, this just seems kind of unintuitive, but it does happen in the real world. The other example of fracturing being bad is continental Africans versus African Americans. So obviously these different groups of people have hugely different lived experiences, and they also value different things because they have different lived experiences. And therefore, when certain like branches of those groups have different amounts of power, then they advocate for different things. I don't know if you would want to expand on this a little bit, Leanda, as well.
So basically the idea here is that often there are or have been attempts to try and have some sort of unified movement or collective idea against anti-Black racism. But the issue is just because racism happens pretty broadly to Black people on the grounds of the color of their skin, often that can simplify or flatten the extent to which the manifestations of those are so different that the actual commonality is very limited. And so that can mean that people are trying to advocate for one specific way people ought to act in regards to Black people when it fails to acknowledge the differences in units. I think probably the best example of this, but this would have been happening 2 years ago, was there was a South African singer named Tyler, and she identified as colored, which was really offensive to African Americans. But in a South African context, colored is like an entirely distinct racial group for Black people. And so a lot of people got very upset about her calling herself this, without understanding fully the context that was different in South Africa as opposed to in America.
That's a really good example, actually. Thank you. In terms of fracturing, fracturing is also very good for having lots of different demands. That's what fracturing is. But it can be good in other instances. So oftentimes having diversity in a movement is very good. Firstly, because it means you get lots of diverse opinions in a movement. And when that happens and those opinions don't compete with each other, then oftentimes that means that you can expand to even more people even faster. So for example, if you have somebody who thinks that climate justice is important because it protects Indigenous communities, then you can connect with people who value Indigenous communities. Whereas similarly, if you have other people in your movement advocating for climate justice because it protects whales, then you can also have people who care about whales in the environmental movement, as a very simple illustration of that. And something which happened was the exact same thing that happened in Gezi Park. Well, obviously it was very different. Happened when the people were out protesting the Montreal Protocol, which was when the US decided that they weren't going to sanction like banning CFCs, which caused the hole in the ozone layer. And there's huge diverse protests, and probably the main reason why those protests were successful, at least drawing to awareness to the issue, is because they connected or resonated with so many people because they were so diverse. Additionally, this is also good with the example of apartheid. So this happens in lots of social movements, but having a fractured movement is also good for having lots of different tactics. I guess similarly for what we were talking about with the NGOs thing, but more specifically in apartheid, there were lots of student groups which advocated for racial justice on like university campuses, for example, whereas there was a much broader movement going on which advocated for it in terms of the government. So it's very good to have different, it can be good to have different layers of your social justice movement, which can like advocate for more sort of like scalar or marginal benefit, like changes to society, whereas others advocating for much more like broad sweeping benefits to society. The difference here is just about analyzing whether these people clash or disagree with each other, or about whether they complement each other, and that's your role in the debate. Yeah.
You could also kind of look at, I guess, the difference between the social and the legal aspect being different kind of fractures the same. So with American civil rights history, looking at the NAACP acting as a legal entity trying to protect, Black people's rights for a long period of time, but while simultaneously having, Martin Luther King at the same time. Different fractions, same, achieving different goals.
Yeah, that's also a good example of that. I think that's all I have. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, Myra.
There's the important indicator that we care about that a movement is fracturing.
As in, are there ways to tell whether a movement is fracturing or not? So ways that you can tell if a movement is fracturing or not. firstly is about how organized the movement is. So if it's a very top-down structure, then it tends to be much more imposed on people what they advocate for, because people are much more ideologically in line with each other. Because if there's somebody at the top who has lots of power, then they're able to boot people out who disagree with the movement. But additionally, it just tends to trend in the way of, if your movement is more broad, then it tends to be more fractured because there's more chance of different groups coming in. But I guess the thing that Kate said also might refute that, because in other instances you can explain that a more fractured movement is one which is much more small and ideologically pure, where the social movement only represents a section of that group because they feel the most vulnerable in that group, but they actually isolate themselves from other people who might be willing to include themselves in that social movement. Does that make sense? Yeah.
With your like Jurassic Park example, as a judge, I heard that be like cool example, but I don't believe that like you haven't convinced me fully that it's like a widespread, like that's a widespread issue. Do you have any advice on like trying to extrapolate that to wider society?
I guess this is always an issue in debates where like the claim is slightly unintuitive, but the example obviously is true. But that's just the point of the example, which is you have to give analysis for why that's likely to happen, and then you say this has happened in this context. So it's likely to happen in a very similar way because we've already seen it manifest like that. And maybe if you want to do your own research, you can research maybe 2 or 3 examples where this happened, and then you're able to incorporate that.
I think you can also just like think about why it probably happened, which is just that the people who are the forefront of a social movement are the most ideological people you can imagine. And ideological people don't tend to know how to compromise, don't tend to discuss things well, and tend to have very strong and differing opinions. So obviously they're going to fracture.
Yeah, that's good.
In a lot of social movement debates, like I feel like closing often just comes up and stands up like developing countries extension, but like that's uncharitable. But I think it is true that social movements definitely look different based on the specific group in which they're in. Do you have a strategic way of handling that differentiation? As in, like, is it important to be able to recognize the difference, or should you as a team just like try and operate under every scenario?
That's a very good question, actually. Do you mean from top half or from back half?
I guess from top half, it's like relatively easy to just be like also in developing countries and then kind of repeat that. But if you're in closing and you can recognize the implication, or even there's like additional ways in which to use top half analysis to get far wider of an impact, is there any way to use it without sounding like you're just being like developing country extension?
I don't think there's any harm in running a developing countries extension. Obviously you'd have to use different reasons, but that's fine because they're in different contexts. So I guess maybe using like country specific examples is something which would help to bolster your newness there in those debates. Yeah.
Hey, yeah, just to add on what you just said, I think the way to go about it is from back half is you have to be like top half, maybe talked about relative benefits that could exist on either side of the house, but they don't actually like solve a problem. So then like your task in back half is to frame the problem as larger in your subset than it is in the top half subset. And so consequently, then you can get away with a developing countries extension if you like actually solve the problem.
Yeah. Kate.
I think that in social movements debates and actually discussing social movements generally, we often default to having this line of reasoning where it's like people make a lot of noise, so this maybe draws the attention of populations or regular people on the ground, and then somehow this makes people change laws, which makes change happen. Do you have any more concrete pieces of stock analysis that you can give us to explain why social movements aren't actually effective at creating change?
Yeah, so I think something which you can use, which is really helpful here, is oftentimes regulation doesn't happen with like the pass of an entire governmental body. I know I said that earlier, but that's just the way that you gaslight the other team. Oftentimes it's like an environmental committee, which you just have to encourage to make more stringent regulation, for example. And that's much more marginal because you just have to convince the person who's at the top of that committee to change their like values and that sort of thing. And that also happens in lots of other government departments, which you can try and convince people of. But also there are loads and loads of ways that you can use money which isn't direct policy change. So maybe if like being gay is banned in a certain country, then the benefit you'd have there is like the highest burden there is making being gay legal. But lots of time you can use money to, for example, like make the safe spaces or pay for people's legal fees or that kind of stuff. And so you can just think of like various ways in which you can use that money. Yeah.
This probably not all that interesting, but I think that when we talk about social movements and how they facilitate change kind of legislatively, there is a tendency to run the piece of like stock analysis, which is politicians are susceptible to it because they're susceptible to public pressure because they care about electability. But I think it, with regard to novelty, you can probably also run that just the greater awareness makes it more likely that a politician will become familiar with the cause and that they are similarly ideological to many of their constituents in terms of like in terms of like believing in things and being susceptible to persuasion that way. And it doesn't necessarily have to be just like court of public opinion. How you would make that out, I'm not entirely sure of that.
No, yeah, that's a very fair point. Yeah, that is good. Yeah.
I kind of hate to disagree with some people, but I'm kind of agreeing with others. But like, if you look at the US, if there's a policy that has like no support, there's like a 40 to 50% chance that it passes. And if there's a policy that has like support from 90% of the population, there's also about a 50% chance that it passes.
Yeah.
So like social advocacy, if you're talking about on the like scale, like the smaller scale of the I've already forgotten what they're called, like the broad movement versus the safe spaces. If there's still like social advocacy for something, you could as like the safe spaces. If the broad movement is advocating that they're going to like make broader policy changes because they have more support, if you are the safe space, then you can kind of point to this and be like, we're just as likely to make changes as you are because like we maybe even more likely because we are like a more dedicated group of people and politics doesn't actually work in the way that we're framing it to.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I guess to bolster that analysis, you'd have to give the reasons why the government operates in that way and therefore why it's likely to operate in the 50-50 way or circumstance as well. But yeah, I think that's a very fair thing to point out. And actually something which goes very unrecognized in debates, which is like, yeah, I guess the issue you're pointing out there. Yeah.
The other stop mechanism you can use in lots of things, and also this is passive deterrent stuff. You can say the NAACP doesn't actually need to win that many wrongful termination battles for random Black people in America, because if they win a few of those, the blowback is so big that for the most part, people try to avoid doing that going forward because they're worried about the threat of an established group like that, like the ACLU and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's good. And I guess that helps to answer a bit of Kay's question as well. Yeah.
You can also kind of move that beyond the individual, say, like they only had to win Brown versus Board of Education once. Like they were fighting that same battle for like many, many decades beforehand. They only had to win one case.
Yeah.
And like creating that sort of change.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Alex, which is, well, I think sometimes people get caught up in social movement debates about mass political capital and consequently you can sway legislature votes where they don't actually reach for like the lower level impact. So I think like some things that I think are quite good. For example, saying even if you don't get like big policy changes, you like encourage maybe workplaces to change their policies or universities to do so. We were able to fund litigation with the extra money that we've got, even if you can't get like big lobbying legislative change.
Yeah, and I think that's also a really important observation in general for the broad movements claim, which is oftentimes people go for the sort of like, the creme de la creme of the impacts where, you're like changing society, but finding at least to insulate yourself a bit, as well as having the creme de la creme, a little bit of like lower hanging fruit where you can have some more certain change is often quite useful if you're on that side of the debate. Okay, no more questions. What time is it?
I'd pass.
Oh, okay, that's fine. Well, we can get some OAs in the room then.